Good morning and welcome everyone to this event, the launch of a new report by the World Energy Council, the Netherlands, on the impact of COVID-19 on Northwestern Europe's efforts to decarbonize and reach climate neutrality. It's great to be here physically. It's been a while, and we've got a number of great speakers and panels lined up for you, and we're looking forward to a very interactive event, both amongst our panel members, but also with you watching and listening, hopefully from around the world. My name is Sonja van Rensen. I'm the managing editor of Energy Monitor, which is a new data-led website dedicated to the energy transition around the world. And I have the pleasure of facilitating today's launch for you. Maybe to say the timing seems impeccable. The World Energy Council Netherlands introduces a report every year. There was one last year, then COVID came along, and hence we have an updated version today looking at how COVID has impacted the scenarios, the plans for moving to net zero and meeting the Paris climate goals. Earlier this year, we had the EU committing to a 55% emission reduction target. We had the Biden Climate Summit, new ambition also on the other side of the Atlantic. We had the International Energy Agency's net zero roadmap just earlier this week. We have a complete overhaul of climate and energy legislation in the EU to look forward to in summer. We have COP26 at the end of the year. And looking forward a little further, we have the next World Energy Council global meeting in St. Petersburg in 2022. And after that, to take stock of where we stand midway to 2030, we have the World Energy Council meeting after that due to take place here in the Netherlands in Rotterdam in 2025. We're here today to focus on Northwestern Europe. If there is a region in the world which should have a good chance of getting on track to net zero, I would say it has to be here. Lots of exciting developments. Offshore wind and hydrogen are just two that come to mind. And we're looking forward to speaking to our panel, finding out a bit more about how we can accelerate developments in those fields. A few housekeeping points before we start. First of all, please do send in questions. They'll be forwarded to us, and we'll try and take as many of those as we can. Secondly, the session is being recorded. If you don't note down everything, you'll be able to re-listen to it. The new report is live as of now. Please stay with us. But obviously, if you want to have a look, you're welcome to do so. And finally, we'll ask you just to quickly, briefly evaluate today's event at the end. Then, before we start, we wanted to turn things around a little and put a question to you. As I said, today's topic is what is the impact of COVID-19 on decarbonization here? And we wanted to ask you, do you think it has accelerated decarbonization here in Northwestern Europe, or do you think it has slowed things down or not had much of an impact? So can we have this question up, please? And then we'll have a look and see whether we can get it and what you think on this question. We're not expecting any definitive answers, of course. And I think what's most interesting and what we will discuss in the panel is not so much whether there's been an impact in the past year, but indeed whether there's been more of a structural change, a lasting change, would effectively mean that global emissions peaked in 2019. Can we get the question? I'll just leave it a second. If not, we will perhaps come back to it in a moment. There we go. We've got the answers coming in. So, has COVID-19 accelerated decarbonization? 60% of you are saying yes, and 40% are saying no. Okay, it's not quite a 50-50 split. Nonetheless, I would say amidst all the enthusiasm we've had recently, and the IEA's report notably just setting out how much needs to be done, green recovery efforts and so forth, I think 40% thinking or believing that there's not been an acceleration, not going to be an acceleration, is still a significant number, and demonstrates perhaps just the sheer immensity of the challenge before us. So let's move on to our first speaker then. I'd like to welcome Jan Willem Veldhuizen, Chief Economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers Europe. Welcome. Nice to see you in the flesh.
Morning.
He's an economist, of course, by training, has worked for a long time as an economics professor, notably at the University of Groningen. A good energy focus there, I imagine. And as I said, is today chief economist at PwC Europe. Jan Willem is here as the coordinator of the new report that's being launched at this event. And the question we just put to everyone watching is, of course, the question that you too have tried to answer. So curious to hear your thoughts, maybe briefly on the outcome of the poll, and then, of course, to get into the meat of the report and tell us what conclusions you have come to.
Thank you, Sonja, and good morning to everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to give the highlights of the report that we wrote this year. It has been a pleasure, as it has been for the 6 earlier versions, the annual earlier versions, to be the coordinator of a report and to work along with a group of experts and participants on a report. Every year, as said, the World Energy Council Netherlands selects a topic, and with the ambition and the mission to fuel the debate and the thinking around carbon neutrality and the energy transition. Again, this year it was the pleasure and the privilege to be the coordinator of a report. I've prepared a couple of slides, and we saw the answers that you gave a moment ago, and that was in fact what happened last year when we produced our earlier report in March 5th, I think it was, in 2020. We were pretty optimistic because we said, yes, it is an immense task to reach the carbon neutrality goals in 2050, but this region, this continent is well suited to achieve that, and we ended with an optimistic message that we said, yes, it's going to be an immense task, but there are reasons to be cheerful. There are reasons that we might expect that we can indeed, with quite a number of efforts and quite a number of actions to be taken by everybody almost, that we can reach carbon neutrality in 2050. So that optimistic message was the message of March 2020. Well, then, for this year, you could say the topic fell into our lap because the COVID year was a year that shocked the economy, shocked the energy system. And the big question, of course, is the report now? Can we now scrap the report? Can we now put the report in the desk and in the drawer, and it has no validity anymore? Or so what happened? So that was the question that we asked, because indeed the year has been an eventful year. It is a year that is packed with uncertainties. The economy has been shocked. The society has been shocked in many, many ways. Just look at a couple of the underlying drivers of the economy. So the way we work is differently. The new normal, the way we travel is different. We don't travel to a large extent. And if we start to resume traveling, then maybe we have been accustomed to working at a distance and have sessions like this at a distance and not travel. So then one of the advantages perhaps of the previous year is that we can now organize these kinds of conferences. You don't have to go there. Well, and these are fundamental changes in our economy, as we will notice. We live differently, so the way we think of where to live, do we live in cities? How do we build cities, or are we feeling comfortable living outside of cities? And what does that mean for commuting? What does that mean for travel? What does that mean for energy consumption at home, in the offices and the new offices? And what does it mean for our traveling? Globalization, so we already saw a bit of a trend of deglobalization, so reconsidering the globalization, so produce the stuff where it's cheapest on the planet, and then with very, very low transportation costs, but with a high footprint, move stuff around. And we were reconsidering that, not just for climate reasons, but also for all kinds of other risky reasons. And that has accelerated actually in 2020. And the same holds for economic function. So just look at the role of the tax authorities, of the governments, of the banks, of the central banks, but all the financial institutions, trying to sustain as much economic activity as possible. So economic functions have changed, and all this. What does that mean for the economy, but what does it also mean for our energy use, our energy system, and for the speed of decarbonization? So this was the question. It was a logical question. It was a question that we had not much time to discuss. We did not take much time to discuss this question. So the question is, have the pivotal events of the Corona year affected Northwest Europe's achievability of the Paris goals? So notice that we have widened a little bit the definitions. It's not just Corona, because mind you, it's not just Corona that happened. Quite a number of things have happened. We also noticed the trends of the droughts in Northwest Europe. So dry seasons, long dry periods, and they have become more. They have led in many parts of Europe to different policies regarding guarding of water. Be more conscious about what that might be, what those big events, what those big first initial signs of climate change might really mean. We have seen quite an exciting, in all kinds of respects, election in the United States, with an outcome that could have been completely different when it comes to energy system and economic growth and achievability of Paris. We saw something that's very new to Europe and which is relevant for the energy system, namely the leaving of the United Kingdom out of the EU. And that potentially has great effects because, after all, the United Kingdom is a strong energy country in Europe with a lot of policy initiatives and so on. So, all in all, we took the year a bit broader than just a Corona year because other events made the year a pivotal year. So what we did, the approach in a couple of sentences is we focus on Northwest Europe. First of all, because it is a more or less homogeneous economic area. It's a rich area, trading a lot. So 75% of the trading that these countries do is among themselves within the EU. So this is a very, very closely entangled economic system. It also is trying to harmonize its economic policies more and more. So there is all kinds of reasons to look at an integrated region, namely this particular region. From a methodological point of view, it's interesting to decompose the question a bit in, so what does it mean? What did Corona mean for the economic growth? What then does it mean for energy efficiency? And what does it then mean for the energy mix, so the decarbonization of the energy mix? Because whether we will achieve the Paris goals is in fact the product of what happens in these three components. And so what the bulk of the report that we have just written goes into what happens after COVID, during COVID, after COVID, with these three ingredients, one after the other, because they're driven by COVID to some extent. You can look at the partners. These are the partners who have worked along with us to produce the results. On the results, on the economy, we have split the period until 2050 into two, which most economists would do at the moment. It's the current situation, the W crisis, the W shape of the dip towards the recovery. Here we have a graph showing that we have looked into the sector by sector impacts, because the impact has been huge, but even bigger in certain industries than in others. And that might, because industries have different energy intensities and different potentials to decarbonize, has a major effect on the carbon content of what we are doing at the moment. But all in all, we believe that this is an essence of a pandemic based crisis, rather than a financial crisis, for instance, is that you keep your economy in hibernation by the lockdowns, and once you dehibernate the economy, the structure of the economy should not have changed too much so that you can pick up business as usual after recovery. So that is the assumption on the short run that we measured and calculated and gave some numbers to. For the longer term, we have relied on economic growth theory, long-term economic growth theory, and we have looked at what productivity could do. And there we have taken a scenario approach, because one of the consequences of COVID might be that we come back to business as usual, and that basically the scenario that we produced last year is going to be valid again. But there is reasons to expect, and there's trends emerging at the moment that might give some reasons for optimism, and that this particular oldish continent is now starting to get on a higher growth path than previously. But if that is the case, so let's focus a little bit. It's easy to look at the previous, at the earlier scenario of last year. So that was we wouldn't have to publish another report, but it is more interesting to look at that. What might happen if indeed we would grow a bit faster? So say from 1.5% on average to 2%, which may not sound a lot if you look at growth numbers from China and so on. But for Europe has a very, very mature economic system, very, very advanced economic system, and aging population. That's quite a jump over 30 years. But if that is achieved, if you grow faster, then you also need to decarbonize faster, because with economic growth goes energy consumption, and you have to decarbonize faster. So that is then the tango that you need to achieve. And that is not an easy task. It is an immense task, as Sonja has also alluded to already, because if it would not have been a huge task, then why wouldn't we be on our way already easily? So it's an immense task. There is reasons to substantiate this slightly optimistic view. So let's look at a couple of early signs of the acceleration. And the report actually goes into quite a number of early signs that we see that might give rise to some optimism. First of all, one of the things, it seems to me that the plateauing of oil demand so peak demand has brought forward a bit. It is there. Also, if you look at the development of the oil price, there are signs that we have that the peak has become sooner. Another thing, in coal, you see quite a definite trend to phase out coal in Western Europe, take it out of at least in the production of electricity, where you see it replaced by natural gas at a large scale within a year, unprecedented. Natural gas seems to be the new baseload favorite. What we also have seen is in the financial world innovation into the direction of how to capture, how to de-risk the bigger projects that on renewable energy that had that intermittency and that volatility, and how to finance that. So new constructions, how to finance that, and how to attract investors in that risky world by securitization and all kinds of innovations. What we are seeing around Europe is this, as people are taking seriously the development of a hydrogen market. If you would have asked us this 6 years ago, you would have been declared silly to talk about hydrogen as much as we do now. And we see the plans and the scaling up of the infant plants. You see the dedication there. And what you see is increasingly education institutes refocusing how we skill people and in what shall we skill people, our new talents. Let's at least take up subjects around energy transition, because that's going to be the future place to work. One of the roles that is central, we think, in the whole strategy is the role of clusters. Here's a graph that depicts a couple of examples of why clusters, and we are richly endowed in Europe, Western Europe, with quite a number of industrial clusters, responsible for 25% of our carbon emissions. If we address those, reduce the coordination costs, and pay the learning curves there, where it's easily achievable, well, relatively easily achievable, develop those circular models that we require, then we can, in a later stage, use those learning costs and scaling up economies of scale for the rest of the society. For instance, in agriculture and in households and the built environment. So that is also highlighted that this is actually, if you look at this graph, each of these things have been accelerated thanks to COVID. Now I need to go to the next slide. Now I go too quickly. Apologies for this. Here we go. Yeah. No. Sorry for this. On the financial side, and there was a report a couple of days ago on how we're going to finance this. What we see there is we see more black swan awareness. So what we see is thanks to COVID, or in the following COVID, what we see is the realization among CEOs and investors and the financial world that yes, black swans are here to stay. We need they have not gone. COVID is here, but climate change and all kinds of issues around decarbonization also generate all kinds of unexpected and new territory also for financiers, and you see that innovation that I just described that is happening. What you also see is this, for instance, an accelerated introduction of the EU taxonomy, which is reducing the cost of investment and it raises the premium of investment in green activities. And what you see is the earmarking of the restructuring funds. Actually, a huge fund from the European Commission, which is earmarked to fund energy and decarbonization investments, which is not just a signal; it's just the money, and it is a wise way of spending money. If you look at if you compare this to the United States plan, where the inflationary elements are very strong, in this European situation, it seems like a very clever and smart move, if you ask an economist. Finally, to close off. Reasons to be optimistic, maybe not reasons yet to be complacent at all. Role for everybody, as it has been the role of the government. This is a public good that we have to manage, the decarbonization. So quite a number of roles of the government, but the government has regained clout over the past year. That's what we saw with the billions and billions of restructuring. They think big. They also need to think clever. So what is the least marginal cost to reduce, and where should we start? And the government needs to explain. We need to take along people on our route. We need also to take the consumers and the voters along, because we cannot afford the risk of losing them. The need for climate partnerships, the clusters, as I mentioned, and finally the financial innovation that comes along with that. And then I would like to stop with Sonja with Emma Watson's quote: "If not now, then when? After COVID, and if not here in Northwest Europe, then where?"
Thank you very much, Jan Willem. I know it's a big report you've spent many months on, so it's not easy to sum it up in just 15 minutes. But thank you very much. I think you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
This is an invitation to those of you joining us to send in questions if you have them, and we will do our best to answer them. We can take a question now if there is one. If not, Jan Willem will be back in our second panel, so you do have a second opportunity. In the absence of a question from the audience, one thing I would like to ask is to come back to the IEA report that we had just this week, which sets out the IEA's vision for a net zero roadmap. The numbers in the report are huge, are massive. When I look, the IEA is saying we need to have net zero carbon electricity in all advanced economies by 2035. No more sales of internal combustion engine cars by 2035. No more oil and gas exploration from this year onwards, et cetera, et cetera. As I said at the start, I think, one of the regions in the world with the greatest potential for net zero has to be Northwestern Europe, with the North Sea, but also with its, sheer prosperity. To what extent does your report and the findings in that, the scenarios you modeled, does that fit with this kind of vision that the IEA is presenting us with? Is it feasible?
Well, when I saw it, I was really pleased because, well, this is always when a report like this of an institution like this is published, then you have to be careful, of course. But I think this is actually what is it? It is a confirmation of what we have modeled in our optimistic scenario. So it is this mood of acceleration, go faster, take the momentum, use the momentum of this cooperation and a sense of urgency, and it's all packed into some concrete steps. I think technologically we can do it. There's some innovation to do still, but technologically we can do it. It's just a matter of scaling up, and so we can. I think we need all the push that we get, also including from the IEA, and that is, I think it's new that the IEA is this bullish. I think it's a revolution with them, and I think it's just a sign and another sign of the increased momentum everywhere, even at the IEA.
Yeah. One question that's come in, and maybe a nice way to round off this initial intervention of yours. So, all in all, is your message that COVID-19 has or is good news for the energy transition? I know it's bad news in a lot of ways, but is it good news for the energy transition?
Well, to be cautious, of course, and the cautiousness is the caution is reflected in the two scenarios. So we have a scenario business as usual, and there's still quite a number of economists and watchers who say, well, this is just in 5 years' time we've all forgotten this and we're back to normal. But yes, I think we spent quite some text in reports to demonstrate why we think there's also reasons to be optimistic, both in the sense of more welfare creation and at the same time decarbonizing the economic system, the energy system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Obviously, you have no crystal ball, but what takeaway then is there are at least signs that this can be something positive to speed things up.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you in a moment, a little bit later. Right, our next speaker then, I'd like to welcome David Hone, who's here to do a keynote for us. He's Chief Climate Change Advisor in Shell's Scenarios team. He's been with the company for a long time, joined as a chemical engineer in Australia back in 1980, has worked in a variety of positions within Shell before ending up doing what he does now. He also sits on the board of various related associations, such as AITA and the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, formerly the Pew Center, as well as the Global CCS Institute. David, you have more than 20 years' experience of working on climate change, and your intervention seems particularly pertinent given that just this week investors again green-lighted Shell's climate strategy to become a net zero emissions company by 2050. And as we've heard from Jan Willem, if anything, there's ever more urgency, ever more pressure to move things along further and faster. So over to you for an insight on your vision for the future.
Good. Well, thank you very much. And let me try and answer the question that you actually just posed about, does COVID-19 really impact the reaching of the goals of the Paris Agreement? So I'll just share my screen. And I think, yes, you can all see that. So Shell, of course, is well known, I think, as a company that uses scenarios. And so these scenarios look out for the remainder of the century, but they're born in the changes that we might imagine out of the pandemic. Before we start, let me just remind you that this presentation has a number of forward-looking statements and therefore should not be the basis for investing in Shell equities. But I think it's true to say that we have a rapidly changing landscape. Of course, there's the climate issues, the related environmental issues, COVID itself, and energy technologies. We're also at a point of change of energy technologies. And how do we make sense of all this? And as I said, that is where the scenario story comes in. At about this time last year, we started on a project looking at the impact that COVID might have on the world, and in particular, what it might do to the 2020s. And we identified three tensions playing out in society. The first of that was around wealth, and this was the strong desire to rebuild economies and rebuild back to where we were prior to the pandemic. The second tension we called security, and represents the focus on the nation state, or in the case of the EU, the region, and the desire to address the pandemic locally, whether that's through health measures, through vaccination measures, or whatever. But it drives a more inward-looking society and a more nationally focused society. And the third aspect was that the pandemic itself led to a broader recognition that the health and well-being of society was really very important. And this isn't just the health of people related to the pandemic itself, but the broader issue of health and well-being related to which also includes the environment. So these three scenarios play out in the 2020s potentially, but they also lead to the way in which the energy system develops over the course of this century. And therefore that has led us to three new scenarios: Waves, Islands, and Sky 1.5. And all of these are plausible, possible scenarios that will see us through in the decades ahead. So let me take you through those and give you a quick insight into what they mean. So Waves first, but this is a story of late but fast decarbonisation. As I said, coming out of the pandemic, the focus is on repairing the economy, on rebuilding wealth and rebuilding the status quo. That leads to a surge in energy use and emissions, but it doesn't address the problems that we already knew existed back in the 2010s, the issues of inequality, the issue of climate change. All of these things are still there. They're not immediately being addressed because the focus is on repairing the economy and driving economic growth out of the pandemic. So the social pressures around these issues intensify. And ultimately, as you get to late in the 2020s and into the 2030s, you have a backlash. And this forces a rapid policy-driven reduction in fossil fuels. It's not so much a focus on emissions, it's a focus on leaving fossil fuels behind us and finding alternatives. But the late start that this scenario brings means that the goals of the Paris Agreement are not met. Now, the world does get to net zero emissions, but it's very, very late in the century. And we end up at the end of the century around 2.3 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So this is what happens in a scenario where economic growth and wealth is the principal driving mechanism. Now, the scenario has also shown that nationalism is a growing trend. And we've seen that just in recent 2 to 3 months around vaccinations. It has brought out to some extent, the unpleasant side of how people think and operate. And so this is a scenario of very late and slow decarbonisation, where the focus is on the well-being of the nation first, of solving the national problems. And of course, it leads to now growing nationalism around the world. It means that there's friction in collaboration, that we don't work as well together across society. And of course, there's friction in trade. Now, in this scenario, economic growth is not as good. It is still a growing scenario, and the energy transition continues, but energy demand growth stagnates and economies stagnate. And global climate action slows. Now, within this story, it's quite possible that regions like the EU make good progress because that's their national priority. But overall, there's a relatively slow progress on clean technology and slow progress on the energy transition. This is not a story where the energy transition stops. Emissions do peak and level off and start to fall later in the century. But by the end of the century, we're at 2.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. We are heading towards net zero emissions into the 22nd century, but the temperature is still rising just a bit. It hasn't quite plateaued by this point because there's still relatively high emissions across society. So this is another possible outcome where the focus is really on the nation first and not on the well-being of broader society. Now, the third scenario, Sky 1.5, represents an accelerated decarbonisation now. The pandemic itself leads to a reprioritisation of what is important in society, and health and well-being, the broader well-being of people and of the environment, rises to the top. Now, we proceed cautiously out of the pandemic itself. The economy's reopened slowly but steadily. And as a result of that, the sorts of practices that we involve ourselves in as a result of the pandemic, such as having this conference over Zoom, bed in. And this starts to create structural changes towards lower emissions. Our cities are redesigned, our work practices change, our travel habits change, everything starts to change. But in solving the issue of the pandemic and proceeding cautiously, there's also the recognition that international collaboration is really important. And so there's recognition of the value in these alignments. This is a story where green investment within the stimulus programs that emerge from the pandemic start to reshape the energy system. The deep structural changes that emerge from the pandemic itself lower emissions, and they set the scene for a rapid transition, and the world meets the goals of the Paris Agreement. We're at 1.5 degrees C by 2100. So we have three scenarios. It's just a question, all three see decarbonisation. The issue is speed. So WAVES is late but fast. It's a delayed but rapid move to new energy sources and carriers. Islands is late and slow. It's a slow shift from oil, gas, and coal as the technology develops throughout the century. And then there's Sky 1.5 with the focus on health, an accelerated transition now where the focus is on reducing emissions quickly. And that's a big difference from just moving to new energy sources and carriers. Now, there's a wealth of detail behind these three scenarios, and obviously we can't go in them today, but we're just setting the scene. But this chart gives you an idea of what goes on in these three scenarios. And in fact, there's many similar things that do go on. All three of them reach net zero CO2 emissions. But is this going to happen in 2060 or not until well into the 22nd century? All three scenarios see CO2 emissions coming down, electric vehicles coming into the system, the gradual or rapid electrification of society. But in fact, electricity becomes more important in all three scenarios. All three see the end of coal use in power generation. And I should say at this point, that these are global scenarios. This is a global picture, not a Northwest Europe picture. So is the global end of coal in power generation, is that in the, after 2050 or well into, 2210? They all see us address land use change, the end of net deforestation. And all of them have new technologies emerging. Hydrogen, for example. Although in the WAVE scenario, with the focus on new energy carriers, hydrogen actually emerges fastest. Now, with a focus on emissions reduction, it's the Sky 1.5 scenario that sees the large-scale development of carbon capture and storage, of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and of rewilding the planet for both purposes of biodiversity and carbon management. These are important elements of the Sky 1.5 scenario because of its driving focus on reducing emissions. And so in Sky, we see something by the end of the century, very large-scale reductions using these technologies and using nature-based systems. So as I said, all three see net zero emissions. In Sky, you actually see net negative emissions in the second half of the century, and that allows the system to correct for 1.5 degrees C. Sky, in fact, is something of an overshoot scenario. We are actually very close to 1.5 degrees C now, roughly 1.2 degrees C with a 0.2 degrees C change per decade. So into the 2030s, and we're at 1.5 degrees C. So we have imagined this is probably going to be an overshoot scenario. But with the very large focus on reducing emissions, Sky 1.5 brings it back towards 1.5 degrees C late in the century. Now, this analysis of temperature was not done by Shell. We remodeled the scenarios with MIT using their integrated model. So finally, 4 conclusions emerge from the scenarios. The first is that actually energy needs will grow. Across all 3 scenarios, we see energy needs increasing. In the Sky 1.5 scenario, due to really strong focus on energy efficiency, energy needs do plateau late in the century, but nevertheless are higher than today. Even in the island scenario, energy needs are higher than today. All 3 scenarios see the energy system transforming. The issue is speed. That transformation will have costs and benefits for society. And it's also very clear that a set of action accelerators are necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The Sky 1.5 scenario sets the scene from the perspective of societal well-being, but it requires rapid change through policy, through innovation, and through societal desire for these changes to take place. These are the action accelerators that are necessary. And it means a strong collaboration between business, consumers, and government to bring about those changes, both at a national level, but also at a sectoral level in sectors that are hard to decarbonize. So let me end there. This is an online set of scenarios because they were developed last year. There is a wealth of information on the Shell website, including the ability to download the data in Excel format and have a look at some of the individual changes that take place in areas such as hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage, and so on, or just straight energy needs. So thank you very much, and back to our moderator.
Rotterdam is ready to host the greenest, most inclusive and technologically driven energy conference so far. We would like to invite all members of the WEC to the Netherlands in 2025 and welcome you in Rotterdam.
Welcome back, and thank you very much for that, David, for providing us with an insight into the kind of scenario mapping you've done, and I think some very clear conclusions on the differences between those scenarios. So what matters, different focal points. Is it the switch to an energy carrier? Is it a focus on emissions? And ultimately, as you said, speed is really what it comes down to. The end point is the same, but the question is how fast can we get there? I see we have a question. I propose we kick off our panel, and then we'll move on to we'll take that question as soon as we've heard from our panel members. So we've got 2 panels for you. This first one is it's focused, well, we'll try and separate them a little bit, focus more on technology. The next one more on economics. Obviously, those 2 issues will interrelate. I'd like to welcome Martien Hoeksma, our first speaker here, Energy Transition Program Manager at Shell in the Netherlands. She's originally a chemical engineer as well, has been with the company for a long time, worked in many different roles, different geographies. I saw you worked in China, as well as here in Europe, upstream, downstream, corporate, operational, and so forth. So you're in a very good position to answer the question, coming back to the focus of the new report today and what David has spoken about just now as well, trying to look a little bit into the future. Would you say COVID-19 has sped up, has accelerated the transition within Shell of moving onto a net zero path and ultimately becoming a net zero energy company?
Yeah, well, so thank you for having me in this panel and for your question. Maybe first I would like to mention that actually COVID-19 has not just had a very big impact on the economy, but also on the health and the well-being of people, and I thought it was important to recognize that as well. But coming back to your question on energy transition, I think Shell has already for a number of years, including recently, made significant steps in accelerating the energy transition. For example, when I go back and think when I started in my role, Shell in the Netherlands actually announced their support of the Dutch Climate Accord. So I was really proud of that. Also, just before COVID last year in February, we announced our ambitions and plans together with GasUnie and Groningen Seaport for the north of the Netherlands on hydrogen and wind farms. So that was already pre-COVID that we made those acceleration steps. But also more recently, for example, last week we announced for Shell in the Netherlands what we call the Powering Progress goals, including, for example, a goal to reach net zero emissions for road transport in 2040. But there are also actual projects, things that we realize. Even a very long time ago, in 2007, we were involved in the first large offshore wind farm in the Netherlands. And we actually own 100% of that now. But also today, Shell Recharge, for example, is installing fast recharges to power electric cars. And we are now about 200 in the Netherlands we have placed, and will reach 250 this year. So lots of things are actually happening. But if I take your question a bit broader and go back to the WEC NL report, I think you could see the impact of COVID as a kind of a hinder on the way, where you maybe see a little bump in the road and then everything goes back to normal. But you could also see it as an opportunity to accelerate the energy transition. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the scenarios come in play. And as Jan-Willem mentioned, you can think of a scenario of going back to business, but also of a scenario where there is economic growth and we actually need to do more and accelerate further to reach net zero emissions as per Paris Agreement.
And what would you say, so indeed we have these two scenarios, and you've given, I guess, some examples too of things that have been ongoing and things. Can you give an example of, I guess, something that COVID has accelerated, and has it actually sped things up? As you said, though Shell was doing a lot of things before it happened. What's different now? Has there been a step change, and do you expect that to last?
Yeah, I think what's different now, if you look at the report, it reflects on what could happen to the energy mix. And if you take the scenario of a high growth economy, then you would need to accelerate the energy transition. And in line with something else that happened last year, the EU Green Deal, I think it would be really important to have a lot of offshore wind installed in large scale. And that's also what we as Shell are welcoming the Dutch government to do, is to go faster and bigger in that sense. But the challenge is there that it requires the whole system integration to be improved. You need to generate the renewable energy, but you also need, for example, for the days that you don't have solar or wind, you need to find ways to deal with that. Have a flexible system, store your energy. There the hydrogen also comes into the picture again. And then you end up with the consumers, but it's not like the previous energy systems, which is a bit more linear. Here it's more circular. It's not just a consumer. If I look at my own rooftop with my solar panels, some days I'm a consumer, but sometimes I'm also a producer. So the key word, I think, is energy integration and how we collaborate in that. And I think what I hope that COVID brought us is that the way we attacked COVID as a society is, I think, really impressive. And I hope we can use those same powers of collaboration to achieve net zero emission acceleration as well.
I guess indeed the key question, as David already said, is how quickly can we do all this? So we can transition, but how fast? Well, that remains to be seen. Thank you. Let's move on to Marcel van der Kar. Welcome. Who's here from Vopak, which is a big tank storage business. So you store all kinds of oil, gas, biofuel, etc. products. He's global director for New Energies there. Has a technical background. Has worked in the storage business for a long time. And I would say energy storage is something I get messages about in my inbox more and more often these days. We have more renewables. We need to store more. The system's going to fall apart otherwise. And I would say, so you're in the storage business. How is a business like yours being transformed? And again, has COVID-19 sped up that transformation?
Yeah, great. Thank you, thank you, Sonja, and great to be here. Great to be part of this report and also today of this panel. As a storage company, we have a motto: storing vital products with care. So we store the products that are important, that are critical, vital to the society of today, that we all use, that we use in our daily life to insulate the houses, to do the transport, part for our food. So the many different supply chains of today will change towards the future. And we want to be part of those vital products of the future as well. And that is, so you're having different supply chain systems, different energy systems that are used today, and we are transforming that while we are using them, and at the same time building new systems. So that's quite a complex transition we are all in as a whole society. And as Vopak, we would really like to play then a part of that whole solution and be a front runner in finding those solutions. And that means that we will still use the systems of today, but make them more and more green or less emission, and get products in that are more sustainable in the same systems. While we're also building the new systems, the new energy systems like hydrogen, CO2, but also more electricity storage at the same time. Partly using the systems and the infrastructure of today, and partly building new systems. So it's quite a complex change that we are making as a total society. And for us as a storage company, it's quite exciting. Also because we see that the new products often have less energy, so they contain less energy, and we want to be more recycling. We want to recycle more products. So it will also increase the need for storage, we think. So.
And how much of it is, I suppose, a repurposing, a conversion of existing infrastructure, and to what extent, do you need to throw out the old tanks and bring in the new?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think we will keep the systems of today, the tanks of today, by blending in more bio-based products, by waste-based products, synfuel products, and at the same time also increase different systems like ammonia, for example, is a green product. If we import green ammonia in the future for transport or for the industry, then there are already infrastructures to handle that. But then we will need much more for handling those products. So it's all together, and I think it's good to realize that the infrastructure that's there today, if we use that as much as possible, then we can also accelerate the whole transition. So it is. We need it all together. I think we need to cooperate with the different parties, and we need to cooperate within the different systems.
Okay, thank you. Let's bring in our final panelist then, René Peters, here from TNO, which is the Dutch Organization for Applied Scientific Research. You've been with TNO for more than 20 years. You're a business director for gas technology, working on the energy transition there. And you've initiated the North Sea Energy Transition Program, which basically looks to transition the North Sea from an oil and gas hub to a renewables hub. We hear a lot about the green recovery. We've heard it on the panel today as well. In theory, we're all transitioning. Suddenly there's a lot of public money available. Things could be, look reasonably rosy for the energy transition. We also heard Jan Willem mention the new IEA report as yet another signal that things are speeding up and need to be sped up. What evidence would you say you see that we are really entering an accelerated transition and that some of these changes are here to stay?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation as well, of course. Within TNO, we are developing technology, but we are also very much looking into application of technology, deployment and investments. So we follow the market. And we do see indeed rapid change. I myself, I'm looking in particular to offshore energy transition. So the transition of the North Sea of a major oil and gas hub towards a renewable energy hub, and also hydrogen. And you do see huge acceleration there in the deployment of offshore wind. We all see that around us and read it in the news. As an example, last year in the Netherlands, we have deployed 1.5 gigawatt of offshore wind in the North Sea, in the Dutch sector, which is actually more than we've ever installed until last year. So in 1 year, we've actually more than doubled the total capacity of offshore wind. And also the targets in the Netherlands will be raised, but also in the countries around us. Germany has raised its targets, UK has raised its targets, and also the European Commission has stated that 300 gigawatts of wind could be deployed in the North Sea. So there you see a huge acceleration. Now, you mentioned the IEA. IEA, of course, has been quoted a lot over the last days because of their statement that they advise to stop investing exploration. But I also would like to mention that in the past, the IEA was not the best organization to estimate the growth of renewable energy. And if we have learned one thing during the COVID pandemic, it's to understand how exponential growth works. In renewable energy, we see exponential growth curves, both in the scale of which the renewable energy is being deployed, the cost reduction which is being realized, and the total investments to renewable energy. That's in solar, which is going basically to less than a cent per kilowatt hour in production in favorable regions, of course, in the Middle East. But also wind deployment. Nobody would have thought 5 years ago that we would have subsidy-free wind parks in the North Sea. So cost reductions have gone quite fast. And all the estimates of the World Energy Outlook of IEA during the last 10 years were always underestimating the growth of renewables in size, in investments, in costs. So you see exponential growth curves. That's for solar and wind. And the big game changers that is now emerging, I think, is hydrogen. You already mentioned it, Martina, and also on the storage side. Hydrogen will be the big unknown to actually solve the decarbonization challenge for the industry and for the heavy-duty transport, the difficult to decarbonize sectors in the Netherlands. And there's the big game changer which could really further accelerate the transition.
A follow-up question, and I'm going to draw on one of the questions that came in from the floor. I guess the question for me and maybe other people is so we have all this green recovery effort. As you say, we've seen an acceleration. You mentioned the offshore wind deployment last year. What do we need from policymakers now that will really cement these changes into place? And I'm going to draw on the question that came in from the floor was, do we see a change in with regard to industrial policy that's moving beyond simply providing subsidies? So I guess a more strategic approach. And for me, that comes down a little bit to the same point of how do we ensure that these changes are really structural?
Yeah, it's a very good question, of course, because everybody is thinking, okay, will this recovery be back to normal, or will we have a recovery which will accelerate, which is what all this study was about, of course. I think a few signs are moving towards accelerated change. You see the recovery fund investments, which is a huge budget, of course, for recovery. It's requiring about a third of the recovery should be focused on investments in renewable and sustainable energy or other applications. You see targets being raised on CO2 reductions on European level, also on national level. You see the ETS system starts to work to raise the CO2 price, and on top of that CO2 national taxes to drive the industry towards accelerated change. So I think there are quite some signs which drive in the direction of accelerated change and policies which should support that.
And Marcel and Martina, either of you have an idea, I guess, from your respective business perspectives, business points of view. What do you believe could make the greatest difference now to keep us onto this accelerated track and prevent falling back to how things were?
Yeah, well, if I may start, I think it's really important to work together between the public and private companies, between the different companies and the government, because the future is not clear yet. I think if we learn one thing as well from COVID is that things can change rapidly, and we need to adapt. We keep adapting, and if you want to make investments, long-term investments, then you want to have a view for the next 15, 20 or 30 years, and that's very difficult in this period of time. But we all want to stimulate that whole transition. So I think that's only possible if you cooperate, really work together between the parties. You need a strong government. You need parties and companies that are prepared to take risks in their investment, but then really looking at it in the future and also be a bit more flexible towards the changes that are still ahead of us.
I guess if anything, the pandemic has changed that public-private our traditional maybe balance with the public sector, with all of this public money being available, suddenly being very much on the front line of being able to steer the energy transition. Obviously, that needs to happen in tandem with the private sector.
Yeah, maybe building on your point of collaboration, I think indeed it's private, it's the policy makers, it's also research institutes. We all need to work together because it's a complex system. So you cannot just change one bit of it. You need to look at the whole value chain, and you need to adjust the policies to make them kind of fit for an energy transition. You need to see how you can stimulate innovation. You need to create new market mechanisms. It all needs to work together to make it possible.
Yeah, and also in the investments, I mean, the industry is looking how to decarbonize their processes and their facilities, but you also need the infrastructure change. Of course, storage is a big part of it, but also transport to enable the new energy carriers like hydrogen, like CO2, which we will have to transport to offshore, to enable the industry clusters to decarbonize. So it's both investment by public organizations or TSOs on infrastructure, which enable and allow the industry to take their share of the decarbonization effort.
And another question that came in, and we're going to have to wrap up soon. I realize the time is too short, as ever, to do justice to you all. The other question that came in was are politicians, do you think politicians are willing to explain everything that's needed in a scenario like Shell's Sky scenario to really get us to net zero? Because those are you know, they're quite big asks of people. And I would add to that, do you think there is a holistic enough vision? You mentioned storage, for example. There will be, if energy carriers are less dense, you'll need to store more. That means as a sector, I guess, your footprint could go up, but the overall system may benefit. I mean, is that taken into account as well?
Yeah, I think you're making a good point. I think the politicians are really there also in the middle between the changes that need to happen in the system, as we just mentioned, between the companies and the government and the Knowledge Institute, but also on the other side with the public. So how do you explain all these changes and the whole transition? That is quite complex. And how do you explain that to the whole public? And indeed, for our sector, it is difficult, I think. It's difficult. I think we want to explain it, well, preferably in one-liners and in short messages. And it's a complex transformation we are all in. And that needs deepening, and that's why I think it's good to have a report like we present today, and to have these type of sessions, so that we are able to explain it. And there will be some parties will even will increase their emissions, because that will help the whole system to decrease the emissions. So that's quite it's difficult to get that in rules, to get that in the politics, in the policies, and for the politics to explain that to the public will also be a challenge. So it's not an easy task we all have ahead of it, but we can only do it together.
And if I may add to that, I think it's more than just explaining. I think you need to get society involved and be part of the decision making, because it will impact all of us, and it will give us opportunities for all of us. Also, for example, in employment of people, etc. So we need to do it together. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and politicians are very sensitive for the public, for public support for the transition. We talk about just transition now, so everybody should feel that it's a fair distribution of cost, but also benefits. I'm not too pessimistic actually about it, because we're all laying solar panels on top of our roofs. Why? Because we earn money with it basically in 5 years. And it comes to a benefit of the individuals. So if we make sure that the changes that are needed for energy transition have a fair distribution of impact, but also benefits, economically or otherwise, I think everybody understands that this transition is needed now. I think we're already well ahead in this discussion, that everybody sees that he has to give a contribution to it.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much, and nice to leave us on an optimistic note, which I think the report today as well, I know it gives us 2 scenarios. Nonetheless, I mean, everyone we've heard from so far has highlighted the signals that are there that we may be on a faster path towards decarbonization, which I guess is good news for us all. And doing it with economic growth, of course, is we want to have the cake and eat it. That's the idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could there be any better place to host the WEC 2025 Global Conference than Rotterdam? This innovative city is the centre of Europe's energy transition and has a highly developed energy-intensive economy. It's the place to showcase how Europe, the Netherlands, and Rotterdam have progressed on its net zero carbon emission ambitions, pledged to meet the Paris goals.
Right, we move on then to our second panel. As I just said in my last breath, we want to decarbonize faster, but we want to do that with economic growth, of course. The idea is to be able to do both. On this panel, we have another three speakers for you, and I'd like to kick off with you, Thijs. Thijs Slot, team lead for electricity markets at DNV Energy Systems. You've worked on power systems all around the world for more than 15 years, and currently focusing on the challenges facing the European energy sector. And of course, our report today focuses on Northwest Europe. Yes. So I would ask you, do you see momentum across the continent here for a green recovery? We hear a lot about it, but is it actually happening?
Well, yes, definitely. And looking back at last year, of course, the thing already mentioned, the all-important Recovery and Resilience Fund to help the European economy recover after COVID-19. Makes available a lot of funds to improve climate measures, including renewable energy improvements. This concerns about 700 billion in investments. I understand that already around about half the nations in Europe have submitted their plans to be able to use these funds. I think there is an important development in terms of the fact that a lot of these funds are already attributed to plans and somewhere also concrete developments developing hydrogen and the hydrogen infrastructure. I think in the previous panel this was also mentioned already. Hydrogen is important to ensure that we put the growing volumes of renewable electricity to good use by transferring it to molecules that can be used throughout economies. So yes, definite momentum, and I think it got a little bit of an extra kick last year, at least on the policy side. Yes.
And maybe take as a concrete example, your own company, you also recently created the energy systems business. I guess how concretely have you changed the way you approach things, the way you approach projects? Are you also experiencing an internal acceleration and then trying to then bring that to the outside world?
Yeah, DNV grew from, well, as far as you could call them traditional, but let's say a traditional oil and gas branch and a traditional electricity branch, former KEMA in the Netherlands. These were more or less developing alongside each other, working together once in a while on system integration topics, but we noticed that more and more of our clients, governments, network operators, but also investors are looking at the opportunities to integrate these different systems, the power and heat, gas, etc., etc. Everything is coming together more and more, needs to come together more and more. So, yes, we thought that this was a very logical step to integrate these two branches of our former business into one. Yeah.
Okay, well, makes a lot of sense, obviously. The customer is king, right?
Definitely, yes.
Let's move on to Katrines Jaapma. Welcome. Katrines sits on the Scientific Council of the New Energy Coalition, which is a cross-sectoral organization in the Netherlands dedicated to pushing forward the energy transition. He's also an emeritus professor on energy and sustainability at the University of Groningen, and you're involved in a whole bunch of research work, notably hydrogen. We've already heard it mentioned, the role of hydrogen, offshore wind, and so forth. So to someone with your experience, a big question seems fitting. It's not new that we're trying to combine economic growth and climate action. Does COVID-19 make that easier?
Well, I hope so, but I think we really need a booster for the energy transition. Just let me give some figures, because sometimes figures tell a lot. 20 years ago, electricity was 10% green. Now it's 40% green, but it took us 20 years and about 1 trillion subsidy. So 40% of electricity is green. However, electricity is only 25% of our energy uptake. So there's the 75% molecules. And of the molecules, which is the liquids and the gases, etc., well, thanks to the farmers and thanks to this mandatory blending that we have, probably 10%, but maybe less than the energy molecules are now green. So there's still 90% to go. And for that, we only have 30 years. So in other words, we need a booster to get there. And then if you look at the molecule part, there are not that many options to green the molecules. So far, we used a little bit biomass from the farming land to green the gas, but it is small volumes. So the biomass also did a bit in the greening the liquids, but there are limitations to that. So maybe we can green the molecules 20-25% with biomass. And the only alternative that's there, that we have to fully develop the next 30 years, is the hydrogen. It's mentioned already. It's producing gases, and from that liquids, if necessary, that provide the green molecules. And as I said, still 90% of our molecules are not green, and they have to become green worldwide, but obviously also in the European Union in about 30 years. So it's a big challenge, and we need a booster. We really need, because the hydrogen system is in its beginning still, small pilots, everyone is preparing, but if you really look at the investment, it is still limited. The plans are there, it's all there, but we need really a booster this decade to get through that, what we call valley of death, to get the hydrogen off the ground. And I think COVID, funny enough, could be a blessing in disguise, because as a result of COVID now, the European Commission, the European Union alone, already reserves over 2 trillion, actually. So it's not only the transition and recovery facility, but it's more. It's also the midterm resources, about 2 trillion, just money from Europe alone. And then in addition, there's the national funding still that you have to add to that. So it's really big money that could be in part used to make this difference. So the booster we need could be kickstarted by the funding that's now released as a result of COVID. So it could be a blessing in disguise. And something similar actually in the US.
But you've said several times we need a booster, but the recovery funding, the recovery actions, that in itself is not the booster for you. That could trigger a booster. I mean, what else do we need to see? Because many people would say all of this, exactly, I mean, almost 2 trillion.
Yeah.
Is that not the booster?
Yeah, well, that is the first booster for the next few years, but there's going to be a multiplier under normal conditions, 0.2 or something like that, 0.15. So that will hopefully accelerate economic growth, which is traditionally, say, about 1.5% in the European Union, to levels of 2% for the next decade, and maybe even the next decades. So it's the booster that we have now, the 2 trillion, plus the multiplier that may accelerate growth for a longer period. And that together, hopefully not leading to just inflation, let's hope, but that together could be used, if used wisely, for this booster to accelerate the energy transition. And maybe 10 years from now in the future, if you look back, we just say it was a blessing in disguise.
Yeah. Okay, so that's, I guess, that's money, which is obviously important. And maybe I turn to Jan Willem now. Jan Willem, who hopefully you recognize from his presentation earlier, the coordinator of the report that we're launching today. That money needs to be complemented by policy. And maybe the question to you, which we also raised in the previous panel, is what for you are the main things that need to happen now to really get this booster effect made permanent to really keep us on this new track?
Well, yes, as I said earlier, I think it is in essence this is a public good. What we call as economists a public good. So the valley of death, passing the valley of death, solve the coordination problems, address those coordination problems, fund the innovation that we still need, and to build that ecosystem for the transition, that is a role that the government needs to take, combined with subsidies and standard setting and putting the flags on the horizon of this is what we need to achieve and so on. Have clarity on that, and then alongside, of course, allows if you want to achieve circular business models to happen, then you probably need to do something with regulation, which is often very silo organized. So it's the whole instrumentarium of the government needs to be put in place, probably. What the government especially needs to do is keep the momentum up. So the government needs to explain to the people and to the voters and so this is what we're going to do. This is what you elected us to find this very, very important, and this is the way we're going to exactly implement what you ask us to do. I think that is pretty crucial, and that communication part is complicated. We need whole conferences like this to tell each other what is happening and why it should be happening. We need to put numbers and so this is not an easy task, but that is a task, and I see, as we said, the momentum coming up. One last an argument for this is it should not be just costs, right? So as a bookkeeper, I would say there's lots of costs involved, but as an economist, you should say there's a lot of benefits to create. So this region can create exportable models. If we do this right, we can make money out of this, bluntly. And that is, and the most economic impact, of course, is that we then clean up the atmosphere and don't have to clean up at much higher cost much later. So there's all kinds of economic benefit reasons also to do this.
Okay, we've had one question come in, which I'd like to put to you, and you can decide who kicks off. Are we still open-minded enough, I suppose, with regard to technology? I know the European Commission, Brussels, always insists, yes, we are technology neutral. Nonetheless, through policy decisions, etc., you may end up supporting some technologies over others. But the person here is asking, are we open-minded enough, or are we driven by political desires? And, for example, are we now saying all we need is hydrogen, or this is, we should be throwing all of our money at hydrogen? That's the question. Are we overemphasizing the potential? I mean, you emphasized too the importance of that. Are we going, are we still hoping that maybe somehow there is still a silver bullet out there?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that it's the electrons and the molecules, that they shape the energy system. There's no alternative to that. And I think the biggest challenge by far for the next few decades is to get the molecules green. Any silver bullet to that would be taken, accepted with great gratitude. But at the moment, if you look fairly, and then there are basically two options that are really big potentially, and that's, as I said, it's the biomass and it's the hydrogen. And for hydrogen, there are two options: either to produce it from the renewables, most likely solar and the wind, or to produce it from natural gas and make sure that the CO2, etc., so that's it's not released into the air. So and for the moment, I think these are the dominant options considered. Hopefully, there's more to green the molecules, but the challenge is so massive that I think we should do whatever we can to get that at least, or the big options at least, off the ground. And the truth is that I think the plans are there, the strategies are there, the money is coming. The industry is increasingly believing that it is going this direction, but the truth is still, if you look at the actual activity on hydrogen, it's still very small. Yeah. Even in Europe, that suggests to be the front runner. Yeah. So there's still lots that needs to be done, but I think everyone is open for any technology. Hopefully there's going to be more options, but we need to green the molecules. Yeah.
I think that's a clear answer. Maybe to you to complement that, there's still a question, of course, over how many molecules are we going to use in future, and to what extent can we electrify, and therefore should we be putting as the first priority, solar, wind power, and ultimately energy efficiency first.
Well, solar and wind power are the cheapest sources to produce electricity nowadays, and even are becoming cheaper. Have a huge potential to generate power in first instance everywhere.
And it's much more efficient to use that directly, of course, than to convert it into hydrogen, if you can.
That's definitely true. So there is a point to make about the fact that the more or less the technology choice for hydrogen is now being made more or less by governments dedicated their funds to these developments. On the other hand, currently, solar and wind also bring the challenge of the weather dependency of our energy supply. And to be able to bridge the really big gaps in non-availability of power in this case, you need to convert power at moments of affluence to alternative energy carriers. Because we don't have batteries that store power, at least not electrochemical batteries that store power for half a year or for a few weeks.
And I don't think, of course, there is always this balance between should we sponsor one specific technology because at this very moment we believe in it, or should we have energy neutrality or technology neutrality. But there is, I think, there is a grey area, and I think we tread carefully at the moment. So the fundamental choice is hydrogen, and then how we produce it. There's 2 or 3 reasonable options at this very moment, so let's push them, because what we need to cross the valley of death. And then after the valley of death, we can open up even more for other technologies. And we have had time to explore all kinds of other technologies. So I'm not too concerned that we are at the moment two-path dependent. Mm-hmm. I've seen worse examples where industry dominates politicians to choose for a specific technology because that's so nicely European. I think I see more relaxedness and more general focus of the governments at the moment, and not a very specific one industry above another focus. Yeah. So I'm quite optimistic there too.
Do you think we're still relatively open-minded?
Yeah. Well, I think, about a decade ago, there were still experts that believed that electrification could go to almost 100%, all electric kind of society. No one believes this at the moment. I mean, a realistic thinking says that, currently it is about 23% electricity in the energy system. The most projections vary between 40% in 2050, maybe 50. Some even go as far as 60%, but that's about it. So roughly half. That's almost all projections, including International Energy Agency, go that direction. So still half of our energy system by 2050, if we are supposed to be green, is based on molecules, and we don't have an answer yet. Well, we have an answer, but we have not done that yet to green that, because, as I said, only 10% of the molecules at the moment is green, which is very small.
And I think the problem is economics at the moment, and scale and learning costs. And it's not the technology. So focusing on the technology is not the issue. Mm-hmm. It's getting the thing done, getting the scale.
And I think also the belief in industry. I mean, if the industry believes this is the way we are going, as soon as it's in their mind, they will start acting on it. I think the good sign is, you didn't mention it, but this is the allowance prices of the European Emissions Trading Scheme. They are, to a certain extent, a signal what the market believes. A year ago, the allowance price was €15 per allowance, which is a ton of CO2 emission reduction in the European scheme. Now it's close to 50.
Was it 50?
Over, yeah.
Well, it's
already
now
hit 50. Yeah.
It hit 50.
Yeah.
So 3 times more within a year. Yeah. And I think this is a signal, because it's a market, the market determines what the price is. It's a signal that the market is increasingly believing, yes, we're going to the green system, and we have to go through massive investment to get there.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I think. Well, politicians make these choices now to develop plans, etc., and there are very good ideas behind it. The choice has more or less been made to try to advance hydrogen as an important, let's say, intermediate energy carrier. Which I think, yes, you need to make a choice at some point to make the huge steps that are required. But for the companies that need to realize these kind of investments, still, of course, the economic bottom line of their business cases remain very important, and therefore, this higher emissions price currently is, of course, an important driver. Also, the EU taxonomy, the new one highlighted by Jan Willem this morning also. So I think these are signs of also politics trying to, not only politics, but also the emissions trading scheme at work, pushing investments in the right direction.
I have another question. I'm conscious we're entering our final few minutes. A question on hydrogen, hopefully relatively quick and easy for at least one of you to answer. Which sectors will use most hydrogen, and which ones will be quickest in taking it up?
Well, to start with the chemical industry, because they need it as a feedstock already now. Also the fertilizer, of course, which is also chemical. Refineries, steel, but that's all industry. Mm-hmm. And then I think this decade also mobility, specifically heavy trucks, ships, maybe even airplanes. They will use hydrogen, and that will develop this decade too.
Okay, perfect. There's one final question I would put then to broaden it out, and we're going to go to our concluding remarks in a moment, which is we focus here on Northwestern Europe. How dependent is the ambition here, which is very high, on what happens ultimately in Europe, but in the rest of the world? And can it serve as a region of example, or are things so specific here that we can do a great job, but while the rest of the world, good luck. And we have done many minutes left, so maybe just a quick thought on that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I had to think of something as well.
Well, we need the Americans.
I think so too. Yeah.
We need the Americans, because if only Europe would do this, and we would green with maximum speed, it could raise issues with competitiveness. So therefore the border tax, carbon border tax, would be something part of the equation then. But if America joins us and China maybe slightly later, that would make the big difference.
Okay.
Yeah, if the momentum is there, and you see the momentum last year, all these laws and plans and schemes in these different regions in the world. What we also need is new diplomacy. So where the green molecules will come from may not be the same regions where we now get our fossil fuels from. So it will also require a whole new system of diplomacy. So North Africa with their solar potentials and very close by. So how are we going to do that? Need to be friendly to some of our neighbours.
Exactly. Yeah. Jan Willem said it correctly, I guess. There's an importance in the long run in developing the hydrogen, of course, in the places where it can be developed most cheaply, or this will take its natural course. I guess if these economies see that there's export potential, and of course there is, especially in this part of the world where we are not so resource abundant. Also not, let's say, cheaply available solar power, which could be a very important driver of this green molecules. And that potential, of course, is much bigger in other parts of the world. And yes, we will need to look for some alignment there as well.
But we now already import 2/3 of our energy from outside the European Union, 2/3 now. Exactly. So for hydrogen, also be prepared for a future where we import serious parts of our hydrogen from North Africa, Middle East.
Except the players may change, so a new geopolitical order will be required. Just to magnify the challenge a little more.
That's true.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your contributions, and looking forward to continuing the discussion as and when possible. Thank you.
Thank you. You're
welcome. Rotterdam is ready to host the greenest, most inclusive and technologically driven energy conference so far. We would like to invite all members of the WEC to the Netherlands in 2025 and welcome you in Rotterdam.
Okay.
Right, we're entering our final minutes, and what we wanted to do to introduce our conclusion for today was give you a chance to answer the question we put to you at the beginning. Do you think COVID has accelerated the energy transition? And let's see what answers come in this time. Maybe what I would say I take away before we get your answers is I think, Jan Willem, you put it very nicely in your opening when you said the economy's effectively gone into hibernation. And I guess the question is, do we wake up and restart where we left off? Or do we move forward? what I take away from what you said about the report then was that there are signs that we have seen an acceleration, we are seeing an acceleration, and that can be cemented, that could be structural. Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball. What I take away from David then is the point that the speed is ultimately what matters. It's not so much that we're looking at different endpoints, but how quickly can we get there, and that of course then has a bearing on climate change and the impacts of that. And then I think Katrien has put it for me, I mean, very nicely just now. It's emphasizing the scale of the challenge. For him, he said, it's greening molecules. That's really the greatest challenge. 90% of molecules are still fossil-based, and we have 30 years to change that. I see the results coming in. 2/3 say yes, 35% say no. So a few more of you are convinced that we are really seeing an acceleration. Jan-Willem, does that...
Yeah, that's a bit what happened to me when we started the report last year. I was pretty skeptical, but I've grown more optimistic while writing. So this is just in sync with what happened to me.
Perfect. We leave you on a note of optimism. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.